The Fed's independence has been called into question. Utah Senator Mike Lee calling for an end to the Fed. In a tweet he wrote, in his words, the executive branch should be under the direction of the president. That's how the Constitution was designed. The Federal Reserve is one of many examples of how we have deviated from the Constitution in that regard. Yet another reason why we should #end the Fed. Our next guest says the senator is standing up for the Constitution with, in her words, courage and insight. And join us now, Independent Institute Senior Fellow Judy Shelton. She was one of President-elect Trump's original Federal Reserve Board nominees. Also with us are Steve Liesman. I was thinking about this yesterday, Judy. It's good to see you. I was thinking about it from the context that it's gotten to the point where if it's a discussion, it's almost heretical. It reminded me of religion to even talk about the idea. It's such a sacred cow. And instead of talking about what might be very good reasons to at least look at the inner workings of the Fed. It's what you always bring to us, the idea that the way the Fed is set up, that it benefited the big money setter banks, and it actually caused them to hoard money because they made $1 trillion combined between all of them instead of lending it out. So instead of questioning the way the Fed works, everybody's like, oh my God, this is heresy. It's almost like saying you're going to, get rid of, I don't know, apple pie and hot dogs or something.
Well, I think it has become kind of sacrosanct in a way that prevents us from talking about improvements at the Fed. And if the definition of central bank independence means no legislative oversight, if it means no limits on the financial capabilities of the Federal Reserve, and if it means no real accountability, the Fed often claims it has responsibility for stable prices, but nobody got fired after we had the worst inflation in 40 years. So I think it's healthy to challenge some of the powers that have been accumulated by the Federal Reserve.
It's almost orthodoxy, which is another religious term that I think.
Well, should there be limits on how much government debt the Federal Reserve can purchase? Should there be limits on how much base money it can create with a computer keystroke? Should there be limits on the amount of interest it can pay to commercial banks at taxpayer expense to keep reserves sitting at the Fed in depository accounts, doing nothing to provide capital resources to the real economy?
Can I say this question, though? And here's one of the great conundrums of this. If you left the Federal Reserve to effectively be controlled by an executive branch or effectively the American public to effectively vote on what they think the Federal Reserve should or should not be doing, which to some degree is what you're talking about. I think there's degrees here about what we're really talking about. In most cases, I hate to say this, I think the American public would actually make the wrong decision almost every single time. And I think the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008 is a prime example of that, given the way the public felt at that time.
That was the Fed that when the public had brought us that.
No. But what would have happened is, left to their own devices, we would have shut down the entire system because people would say, we don't want to give any money to banks. Right? That's what would have happened. If you had done a straw vote of the American public of what to do, they would be like, don't give any money to these horrible bankers. They should get nothing.
That's your opinion. I don't know if that would.
But you mean in the aftermath of a global financial meltdown, and I don't know any other institution that would be more responsible for properly calibrating the amount of money and credit in the system than the Federal Reserve.
By the way,
you're talking about how resolving it.
This is not to defend the Federal, but I'm saying there will be mistakes made repeatedly, and the question is, if you let, there will always be mistakes. Let's just accept. You don't believe that mistakes will always get made? Invariably, there's going to be some level of mistake.
Yeah, but I think you're talking about who should have the ability to manipulate interest rates. You're saying I wouldn't want that to be in the executive branch or the legislative.
Correct.
But as the Federal Reserve, should they be doing that?
Although the one point we've made is that we've never seen a president who wanted higher interest rates because it's counter to what they're trying to do, which is stoke the economy and keep things going.
Especially real estate guys.
Can I just make one point of fact, which is that Senator Mike Lee is barking up the wrong tree.
Barking up the wrong neck of the woods.
Whatever. The Federal Reserve is a creation of Congress. The problem is not that the executive branch does not have control over the Fed, because the executive branch did not create the Fed. The Fed is not part of the executive branch. If you have a problem with the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve Act, it's a problem of Congress. This flows from the controls of the purse, which is the prerogative of Congress. And that I think the questions that Judy asks are interesting and worth exploring. Should there be limits on how much debt the Fed will make? Right. But those are prerogatives of Congress to put on. And there's a reason for that, because of some of the things that Andrea said. Whether or not you want to be paying banks to limit the floor on interest rates is an interesting question. Yeah. But you can't say that, like Senator Mike Lee did, which I kind of think is a little embarrassing, right? That the problem is the executive branch thing. It's not the executive, it's Congress. If Congress wants to limit these things, it has every ability to get together and do so, but it hasn't done so. It has given the Fed, what Judy points out in an interesting article, is a tripartite mandate, not just two. Correct. There's inflation, unemployment, as well as stable credit. Moderate long-term rates. She wrote an interesting piece on that. But if it's not doing so, and I would just push back a little bit on Judy in the sense that there is oversight of the Fed at Congress. They report twice a year in the Humphrey Hawkins. Anytime the Fed, the Congress wants a Fed official to come, they go and they do provide testimony, and they also respond. If that oversight is not sufficient, it's a problem of Congress, is what I would point out.
Well, Steve is exactly right in the sense that the Fed does answer to Congress because that's in the Constitution.
Right.
That's Article 1, Section 8. Right. And so it's up to Congress to regulate the money. And they have farmed out that responsibility to a government agency.
Right.
And so I think that's what we're talking about. I just want to say, too, though, you mentioned Trump being a real estate guy. In 2015, when he was first beginning to run for president, he acknowledged that. He said, I'm a real estate guy. Of course I love low rates.
Yeah, he said that frequently.
But he also said, but think of the people who are being responsible, who don't own financial assets, who are putting money in the bank to save for retirement every week. He said they are getting creamed.
Yeah. But that was before he was president, too. I mean, I literally have never heard a president say, we wish...
No, but think what happened to him. He came in, and the very next month, the Fed raised interest rates. This was under Janet Yellen. In 2017, they raised them another 3 times. Yeah. Then Powell came in. In 2018, they raised them another 4 times. So 8 consecutive increases after being at near zero for all those years post-2008. And Trump made, I think, the logical argument. He said, we haven't hit the target. We're under your 2% target rate. We have record low unemployment that's benefiting minority groups and bringing in more worker participation. We have good economic growth, good productivity. Why would you deliberately, preemptively curtail growth and limit employment when there's no inflation?
Rates came down and